Hello, everyone. So, to balance all of the political history that we've covered so far, I want to begin this week by covering some examples of American Indian individuals in popular culture. This will just be a snapshot of some notable references to help expand your knowledge of American Indian culture in the modern or postmodern era. Some of you may have heard of the band called Redbone. Redbone was a rock and roll band from Los Angeles that formed in the turbulent year of 1969. The band members had Native American and Mexican American heritage. The term Redbone is a term that describes a person with a mixed racial background. So the band reached the top 5 on the Billboard charts in 1974 with their hit single "Come and Get Your Love." You may have remember this from the movie Guardians of the Galaxy. Let me see if I can get it to play here.
What the matter with your hair? Yeah. Come and get your love. Come and get your love. Come and get your love.
In 1973, after the American Indian movement occupied Wounded Knee, i.e., the clips that we watched last week, Redbone released the song titled "We Are All Wounded at Wounded Knee."
At Wounded Knee, you and me, we were all wounded. At Wounded Knee, you and me, in the name of manifest destiny. You and me, you and me, you and me. They made us many promises, but always broke their word. They penned us in like buffalo, drove us like a herd, and finally on the reservation where we'd gone for our preservation, we were all wiped out by the seventh cavalry. You and me, you and me, we were all wounded at Wounded Knee.
In its lyrics, it referred to the Wounded Knee massacre of 1890 that followed the Ghost Dance religious movement that we talked about. But insofar as they wrote and released the record in 1973, it was also a very politically charged song, and it was banned from most radio stations at the time. A quick look at the art world introduces us to figures like Dakota artist Nellie Two Bears Gates. Gates was a popular artist at the turn of the 20th century. Her piece, called Suitcase, used beadwork to depict a traditional Dakota wedding scene. Although her subject matter dealt with traditional culture, her use of modern luggage as an art material reflected a more avant-garde artistic sensibility. The theme of travel that the suitcase represented also blended traditional and modern themes in a way that spoke to the American Indian experience at the time. Next here we have Luiseño artist Fritz Scholder. He was a well-known artist in the 1970s. His travel group was actually from La Jolla near UC San Diego, actually up in Escondido. His expressionist paintings blended Native American and US cultural themes. More to the right on this slide, we have James Luna, who was more of a contemporary performance artist. He also worked in Southern California. His work dealt with themes of identity and representation. He often included critical social commentary in his work. For example, in the bottom picture shown here, he is presenting himself as a museum piece. This was a critique of the way that museums have helped to objectify living indigenous cultures in a problematic way. This next slide includes American Indian scientists and social scientists, as well as actors and political figures. On the far left, we have Lakota anthropologist Beatrice Medicine. She contributed to cultural and language revitalization projects in the 1970s. To her right is the Navajo physicist Fred Begay, who helped develop nuclear fusion technology as a form of renewable energy. To his right is the Potawatomi botanist Robin Kimmerer. We mentioned her earlier in the telling of Sky Woman Falling. She is working today to help bring traditional indigenous knowledge of plants and the environment into current scientific research. To her right is Choctaw engineer Patache Ballerino. She currently works in NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory and was part of the design team for the Cassini mission that visited Saturn. Below on the left, we have Cherokee actor West Studi, who paved the way for Native Americans in the movie industry. He is famous for doing westerns like Dances with Wolves and Last of the Mohicans. He was also a voice in the movie Avatar, and he was a detective in the 1995 action thriller Heat with Al Pacino. And to his right is Deborah Holland, who is the current Secretary of the Department of the Interior. She's from the Laguna Pueblo in New Mexico and was formerly a member of the House of Representatives. So, wrapping up this little snapshot of American Indian individuals in contemporary modern culture, the challenge is to see these examples of native modernity as extensions of traditional tribal culture. This is opposed to the idea of assimilation. More realistically, using critical thinking, native modernity is more of a gray area with a little bit of both cultures, depending on which example you are looking at. The trick is really to see that all cultures borrow, invent, and change over time. No culture or cultural identity is completely stable or authentic. This is true for all peoples before the modern era, but the modern era accelerated the process. For this course, the thing to highlight is that Native American culture influenced US culture and global culture, just as US culture and global culture influenced Native American culture. In world history, the prime mover is always the ever-changing political economy. It is what drives social and cultural changes for everybody impacted. In turn, these cultural changes bring new forms of political consciousness, which then turn back to influence the direction of global politics and global economics. This lesson in world history brings us back to the politics of history and historiography that we discussed in week 1. Due to settler colonial ideology, U.S. historians have often erased the presence of American Indians in the modern world. This is the same thing as denying them historical agency as actors who shaped the direction of history. This view has trickled down into popular U.S. culture and has become a common way of thinking for many everyday people. This course is designed to push back against this way of thinking. So now that we have corrected this historical misconception, the pressing issue going forward is to see American Indian issues in current events around us, and also to see that these issues that affect American Indian communities are also issues that affect all of us. And we need to see our positionality in relationship to them, and also appreciate what they mean for Native peoples. As we consider present-day current events, let us pause for a moment to reflect on the arc of the American Indian self-determination movement. In the history books, the term self-determination is usually used to discuss events that happened after the termination era, which was after World War II. It is true that the term became popular at this time, but with what we've learned, we can see that the principle of self-determination dates way back to the early moments of European empire. So some of the early examples are anti-colonial resistance and anti-colonial tribal confederacies, the social movement of Pan-Indianism, the Ghost Dance, the Society of American Indians, and the urban Indian experience Those are all things that we can put under the framework of self-determination. An intermediary event was the Indian New Deal and the Indian Reorganization Act. The self-determination movement officially launches around 1944 with the National Congress of American Indians, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, which had a special subcommission on the prevention of discrimination. And then after that, we see that the termination era begins to wind down with different policies and presidential statements. This is also the time of the American Indian Chicago Conference. The next stage is the Red Power movement. With this, we see examples like the National Indian Youth Council and the American Indian Movement. After World War II, the self-determination movement in North America became a global movement for indigenous rights. This shift began in 1947 in the United Nations with the creation of the UN Commission of Human Rights. This turn of events coincided with indigenous self-determination movements that were then unfolding in Canada, Mexico, Australia, Brazil, and in a variety of other places in South America, Asia, and Africa. Notably, in the late 1960s, indigenous groups began forming non-governmental organizations that put pressure on the UN to protect the rights of indigenous peoples. This includes rights to land, rights to natural resources like water, protection from environmental destruction, ceremonial rights, culture and language revitalization, and other social justice issues. These battles have continued into the present and are shaping the future of international law. A key event is when, in 2007, the UN passed the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The creation of this document was rooted in indigenous self-determination movements in Canada, New Zealand, and in the US. Hence, the declaration was a product of social movements. This document outlined a number of individual and collective rights for indigenous peoples worldwide. It was a non-binding agreement, however, which meant that member countries needed to sign on to it voluntarily. As it happened, every member country in the UN did sign on to the declaration except for the settler colonial countries with the biggest indigenous populations. This included the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These countries did eventually sign on. The US was the last holdout. It refused to sign until 2010, 3 years after everyone else did. Altogether, the Declaration is maybe the biggest victory for indigenous rights worldwide. Another global issue are Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. These have taken place in countries like Australia, Canada, and in Northern European countries like Sweden and Norway, which have their own indigenous populations. These kinds of commissions address historical traumas through public apology, organizing reparations, and the creation of new reforms and protections. In doing so, they help to heal old wounds. Efforts to hold one of these commissions in the United States, however, have not been successful. Additional news from the international arena is that in 2023, Pope Francis repudiated the doctrine of discovery, which the Catholic Church first issued in 1452, well before the time of Columbus, when Spanish and Portuguese sailors began exploring the oceans. This symbolic gesture of Pope Francis helped to address historical wrongdoings of Europe throughout the age of European empire. Although the UN has a humanitarian bent, it is also a venue for global power politics, and it has neo-colonial elements. Thus, when indigenous communities concede to the UN's power structure, they come under its authority, kind of like American Indian tribal relationship to the federal government. In some sense, it can be a trap. So when indigenous communities do this with the United Nations, member countries can twist the concept of indigenous self-determination into new forms of incorporation and control. Hence, member countries like Canada or the US might make public promises in favor of indigenous groups, while behind the scenes they work to undermine indigenous rights. This is typically done to control abundant natural resources that exist on indigenous lands, like coal, oil, uranium, and other precious minerals. So when powerful countries talk about supporting the economic development of poorer countries or indigenous communities, it is often code for resource extraction that benefits their states and corporate interests that are tied to them. When powerful countries use the idea of economic development to target indigenous communities, these communities are usually not consulted, they usually do not benefit, and they are often harmed in the process. The lesson here is that although there are benefits in international law, it can sometimes reproduce the structural inequalities of globalization. This is comparable to the earlier structural inequalities we talked about that went hand in hand with modernization and the coinciding underdevelopment that we discussed in week 3. One of the tricks that democratic countries often use these days is to define indigenous communities as just one of many racial minorities in their multicultural democracy. This is seen through the framework of liberalism. This tactic erases the distinct political status of indigenous peoples as sovereign nations. So, although we are all familiar with the positive ideals of multicultural democracy in a civil rights framework, in this case, settler colonial societies use this concept to incorporate and assimilate indigenous peoples. An important lesson here that you should take away is that American Indians are indeed part of the story of racial discrimination, but they also have distinct sovereignty rights that are rooted in history. On the brighter side, this discussion of indigenous rights in international law is also a story about how tribal nations have helped to shape modern political developments. It has its problems, to be sure, but it is also an opportunity to shape the future in a more just and equitable direction. To end this lecture, I will briefly mention some recent events that are linked to the ongoing movement for indigenous self-determination. As we will see in the documentary this week, in 2014, the corporation called Energy Transfer Partners began planning the Dakota Access Pipeline. It was designed to run from the recently discovered shale oil fields in North Dakota, and it was going to take that oil down to Illinois for distribution in the market. It was part of a larger fossil fuel extraction system that the corporation operated around the US. In the planning stage, the corporation met with the leadership of the Standing Rock Sioux Indian Reservation to discuss tribal territorial boundaries that interfered with the construction of the pipeline. The Standing Rock Sioux didn't want the pipeline because it was going to be built underneath the Missouri River. If the pipeline leaked or broke, which these things often do, it would ruin their main source of fresh water. It would affect them and everyone else downstream. For them, the Missouri River was also sacred, and it was surrounded by indigenous burial sites. The U.S. eventually used its authority to force the pipeline's construction, and in doing so, they broke a number of treaty rights. To try to stop the construction of the pipeline, the Standing Rock Sioux and neighboring tribal groups organized a class action lawsuit. They also organized a direct action protest that highlighted the issues of tribal sovereignty and human rights. The local police and the National Guard were then sent in to squash the protest. Despite the media attention that the protest generated, the pipeline was eventually built. There were 5 oil leaks in the first year of operation. Around the same time as the Dakota Access Pipeline was being built and protested, another pipeline known as the Keystone XL pipeline was being built by another corporation to transport tar sands from mines in Canada to the US. Once in the US, it would be processed into crude oil and distributed globally. Crude oil from tar sands is an especially dirty fossil fuel that is now being used because other sources of oil have been depleted. In 2015, widespread protests pushed the Obama administration to veto the pipeline. Obama acknowledged that it was a threat to the climate, to ecosystems, to drinking water, and to public health. The Trump administration later reopened the project, and then after that, the Biden administration closed it again before construction began. A slightly different issue regarding tribal self-determination was linked to the construction of the border wall. In a local story, in 2020, the Kumeyaay tribe protested the border wall because its construction was going to destroy sacred burial sites. The Kumeyaay Reservation exists on both sides of the US-Mexico border, near San Diego and Tijuana on both sides. Despite the protests, construction continued. The Army Corps of Engineers used dynamite to blast for the wall construction. In the process, indigenous artifacts and bones were found at the blasting site. When government officials visited the site to try to investigate, the Border Patrol blocked them from observing. After this, a grassroots group called the Kumeyaay Original Peoples Alliance organized a major protest at the construction site and also in downtown San Diego. One of the representatives, named Blue Eagle Bahil, who's a member of the Viejas band of the Kumeyaay, said, quote, "We're sick and tired of not being at the table when our ancestors are being dug up. Our ancestors fought for and died for us," he said. "It's time for us to start saving our history and passing it on to our children, instead of just watching it get desecrated." As it happened, construction of the wall ended when Trump left office. In the 2023 Supreme Court case, Holland v. Burkine, a number of white plaintiffs from the states of Texas, Louisiana, and Indiana declared that an old law called the Indian Child Welfare Act was unconstitutional. The Child Welfare Act was originally created to prevent indigenous children from being adopted into non-native homes, because these types of adoptions were an assimilation practice that had genocidal overtones. To repair this history, the Act gave jurisdiction for child custody cases with things like foster care and adoption cases. They gave that jurisdiction to the tribal governments. So in this case before the Supreme Court, the white plaintiffs argued that this was a form of racial discrimination against white families and therefore unconstitutional. So this kind of lawsuit mirrored the recurring problem that I mentioned above, which is that the idea of tribal sovereignty is being pushed aside and being replaced with an idea that indigenous people are just a form of racial difference. Only under that kind of framework can a discrimination case be made. What this kind of lawsuit misses is that this isn't about race, this is about the political status of sovereignty. In the end, the Supreme Court upheld the Indian Child Welfare Act and therefore upheld the principle of sovereignty, but they did so on a technicality, and the distinction between race and sovereignty was never really resolved. Another ongoing issue is the phenomenon of missing and murdered indigenous women and girls. For decades, Native Americans and Native Alaskans have struggled with a high rate of assault, abduction, and murder for women. Community advocates describe this crisis as part of a legacy of generations of government policies like forced removal, land seizure, and genocidal violence. They see it all as part of the same general sweep of history. A 2016 study by the National Institute of Justice found that more than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaskan Native women, this is 84%, have experienced violence in their lifetime, including 56% who have experienced sexual abuse. Overall, more than 1.5 million American Indians and Alaskan Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime. This far outweighs the rates that are experienced by other ethnic groups. final issues that I will note in passing here are the issue of culture and language revitalization. These kinds of projects are taking place in many tribal communities around North America, South America, and around the world. Another final note is about the topic of Indian gaming or casino gambling. This was part of a economic development plan that took place since the 80s, and there is a lot to it with regard to pros and cons. Unfortunately, we don't have time to dig into these and a great many other topics that are of interest with American Indian history. So with that, this wraps things up for my lectures. Good luck with your final papers. Please email me with any questions.